There was a moment, some time in the middle of the year 1614, when 9 men stood on scaffolding in the nave of Antwerp Cathedral and lowered a body wrapped in white linen toward a group of waiting figures below. The body was not real. It was paint on wood, but the men who painted it had understood how a dead man's arm falls differently than a living one's, how fabric catches on a shoulder and pulls taut across a thigh, how those who carry grief also carry flesh. The central panel of the triptych measured more than 4 meters tall. Christ's body descended diagonally across the composition, pale as winter light, held by hands that strained and cradled in the same gesture. Above him, the cross stood dark against a sky that had begun to open. Below, his mother reached upward, her face already emptied by what she knew was coming. The painting was so large that to see it whole required stepping back into the center of the cathedral. To see it closely required climbing toward it. But from any distance, the body fell. The man who designed this painting, who sketched its movements and blocked its light and painted the crucial passages himself while his assistants worked the rest, was 37 years old. His name was Peter Paul Rubens. He had been back in Antwerp for 6 years after spending nearly a decade in Italy. He was married. His wife Isabella was the daughter of a prominent Antwerp family, and she had given him a daughter and would soon give him 2 sons. He owned a house on the Wapper, a canal street in the center of the city, and he was in the process of turning that house into something between a palace and a factory. He read Latin and Italian fluently. He corresponded with scholars across Europe. He had worked for dukes and painted altarpieces for churches that still smelled of fresh plaster. He moved easily among princes and churchmen, and he was beginning to understand that the work he could do with a brush might also be done with words, with letters sent across borders, with the careful construction of trust between men who had reasons not to trust each other. But in 1614, standing in the cathedral as the triptych was installed, he was still primarily a painter. The descent from the cross would make him the most famous artist in Northern Europe. It would also show him what he was capable of, not just the technical mastery, which he already possessed, but the fusion of everything he had learned into a single image that could hold both the weight of a body and the collapse of a world. Peter Paul Rubens was born on the 28th of June, 1577, in the town of Siegen in Westphalia, which is now part of Germany but was then a small center in the patchwork of territories that made up the Holy Roman Empire. He was born in exile. His father, Jan Rubens, was a lawyer and alderman from Antwerp who had fled the Spanish Netherlands in 1568 as religious and political tensions turned the Low Countries into a battleground. Jan Rubens was a Calvinist, or at least he moved in Calvinist circles, and Antwerp, which had been one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in Europe, was becoming dangerous for those suspected of Protestant sympathies. John took his wife Maria Pipelinks and their children and went north, settling eventually in Cologne. There in 1571, Jan Rubens became the legal advisor to Anna of Saxony, the second wife of William of Orange, the leader of the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. What happened next shaped the early childhood of Peter Paul Rubens, though he would not have understood it at the time. Anna of Saxony was unstable, possibly mentally ill, and certainly unhappy. William of Orange was often away. Jan Rubens, a learned and attentive man in his 40s, became her confidant and then her lover. When the affair was discovered in 1571, Jan Rubens was arrested and imprisoned. He faced execution. Maria Pipelinks, pregnant and desperate, negotiated for his release. She wrote letters, petitioned, begged, and eventually secured his freedom, though he remained under house arrest for years. Peter Paul was born during this period in Siegen, where the family had been allowed to move under strict conditions. His father was disgraced. His mother had saved him. The family lived in reduced circumstances, dependent on Maria's determination and the small income they could generate. Peter Paul's earliest years were years of confinement and shame, though they were also years of intellectual richness. Jan Rubens, confined to the house, educated his children himself. He taught them Latin, he read to them from classical authors. He impressed on them the importance of learning, of eloquence, of conduct. The household was quiet, watchful, constrained by the knowledge that their position was fragile. In 1578, when Peter Paul was a year old, the family was allowed to return to Cologne. Jan Rubens remained under supervision, but life became slightly less precarious. Peter Paul grew up in a home where books mattered, where language was both a tool and a weapon, and where the consequences of desire and error were visible in his father's diminished standing and his mother's exhausted vigilance. When Peter Paul was 10 years old, his father died. The year was 1587. Jan Rubens had never fully recovered his position, though he had managed to restore some stability to the family. His death left Maria Pipelinsk with 6 children and limited means, but it also freed her to return to Antwerp, which she did in 1589. The Antwerp she came back to was not the city she had left. It had been sacked by Spanish troops in 1576 in an event known as the Spanish Fury, and in 1585 it had fallen to the Spanish general Alessandro Farnese after a long siege. The city's Protestant population had largely fled. Its economy was damaged, but it was being rebuilt, and the rebuilding was Catholic. The churches that had been stripped and vandalized during the iconoclastic riots of 1566 were being refilled with altarpieces and sculptures. The Jesuits, the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, were establishing schools and building chapels. The Spanish Netherlands, under the rule of the Archdukes Albert and Isabella, were being re-Catholicized with a combination of force and persuasion, and art was one of the primary instruments of that persuasion. Maria Rubens understood that her children's future lay in alignment with this restored Catholic order. She herself seems to have returned to Catholicism without difficulty, or at least without public difficulty. Peter Paul and his brother Philip were enrolled in a Jesuit school. They were taught rhetoric, grammar, classical literature, and the forms of piety that the Jesuits promoted. Peter Paul was a quick student. He learned to write elegantly in Latin. He absorbed the classical references that would later populate his paintings, but by the time he was 13 or 14, it was clear that his path would not be primarily scholarly. He wanted to paint. In 1592, when he was 15, Peter Paul was apprenticed to Tobias Verhaeghe, a landscape painter. The apprenticeship was brief. Landscape preeness was not what interested him, or perhaps Verhaeghe was not the right teacher. Within a year or so, Rubens moved to the studio of Adam van Noort, a more established and more volatile master. Van Noort painted religious subjects and genre scenes, and he was known for his rough manner and his emphasis on drawing from life. Rubens stayed with him for about 4 years, learning the fundamentals of composition and figure construction. Then, around 1596, he transferred to the workshop of Otto van Veen, known as Venius, who was the most intellectually ambitious painter in Antwerp. Venius had studied in Italy. He painted in a Romanist style, meaning he had absorbed the lessons of Raphael and Michelangelo and tried to transpose them to the north. He was learned, well-connected, and interested in allegory and emblem. He moved in the same humanist circles that the young Rubens aspired to. Venius treated painting as a liberal art, not just a craft. He read, he wrote, he cultivated patrons. Rubens stayed with him until 1600, absorbing not just technique, but a model of what a painter could be, someone who worked with his mind as much as his hands, who could speak to princes and scholars on equal terms, who could use images to convey complex ideas. By 1600, Rubens was 23 years old. He had been accepted as a master in the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke, which meant he was qualified to practice as an independent painter. But he did not stay in Antwerp. Instead, he went to Italy. This was not unusual for a northern painter with ambitions. Italy was where the great art was, where the models of excellence were to be found. But Rubens seems to have understood that going to Italy was not just about study. It was about transformation. He left Antwerp in May of 1600, traveling south with very little money and a great deal of determination. He went first to Venice, which was at the height of its artistic and cultural power. He saw the late works of Titian, whose handling of paint and sense of color would shape everything Rubens did afterward. He saw Tintoretto's vast narrative machines, the dark energies of Veronese feasts. Venice taught him that color and light could carry meaning as directly as drawing, that a painted surface could be both sumptuous and intellectual. By the end of 1600, Rubens was in Mantua, where he entered the service of Vincenzo Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua. Vincenzo was a collector, a patron, and a man of appetites. He kept a large court filled with musicians, poets, painters, and scholars. He loved theater, music, elaborate festivals. He also loved women and horses and intrigue. Rubens became one of his court painters, which meant producing portraits, altarpieces, copies of famous works, and decorative schemes for the ducal palaces. The position gave Rubens a salary, a place to work, and access to one of the great private collections in Italy, which included works by Mantegna, Giulio Romano, Correggio, and Caravaggio. It also gave him something more important: freedom to move. Vincenzo did not keep Rubens on a short leash. He sent him on diplomatic errands, let him travel to study, employed him flexibly. Rubens used this freedom to see as much as he could. In 1601, Rubens went to Rome for the first time. The city was in the middle of a building boom. Pope Clement VIII and his successors were remaking Rome as the capital of the Counter-Reformation, filling it with new churches, new fountains, new palaces, and new images. Caravaggio was working there, painting in a style so direct and unidealized that it shocked even sympathetic viewers. Annibale Carracci was finishing the ceiling of the Farnese Gallery, a synthesis of Michelangelo and Venetian color that would define Roman classicism for the next century. Rubens saw both. He drew from antique sculpture in the collections of Roman nobles. He copied Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican. He studied Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling and Last Judgment, absorbing the sense of bodies in motion, the tremendous muscular energy that Michelangelo could conjure. He began to understand that the great tradition of Italian painting was not a single thing, but a series of arguments about form and color, line and mass, ideal beauty, and observed reality, and that a painter could enter that argument and make something new out of the tension. In 1603, Vincenzo Gonzaga sent Rubens to Spain on a diplomatic mission. He was to deliver gifts to King Philip III and the Duke of Lerma, the king's favorite and the most powerful man in Spain. Rubens carried paintings, including works by the Duke's own collection and copies Rubens had made. The journey took months. Rubens arrived in Valladolid, then the capital of Spain, in the spring of 1603. He presented the paintings, many of which had been damaged in transit. He repainted them on the spot. He impressed the Spanish court with his manners, his learning, and his efficiency. He painted an equestrian portrait of the Duke of Lerma, a large canvas showing the Duke on a rearing horse, dressed in armor, commanding and aloof. The portrait was Rubens's first major commission outside Italy, and it showed he had learned not just how to paint, but how to flatter, how to translate power into image. Rubens returned to Italy in 1604. Over the next 4 years, he moved between Mantua, Rome, and Genoa, taking commissions, studying, building a reputation. In Rome, he received his first major public commission, an altarpiece for the Chiesa Nuova, the Church of the Oratorians, one of the most important new religious orders in Rome. The altarpiece was for the high altar, the most prominent position in the church, and Rubens was still in his late 20s. He painted the subject on slate, thinking the reflective surface would add richness, but the light in the church made the painting hard to see. He replaced it with a canvas version and eventually substituted both with a different composition. The project was frustrating, but it taught him about the practical difficulties of large-scale religious painting, how architecture and light affect an image, how a painting must function in a specific space, not just in the mind or the studio. In Genoa, Rubens found a different kind of patronage. The city was ruled by an oligarchy of wealthy banking families who were building immense palaces and filling them with art. Rubens painted portraits of these merchants and their wives, full-length images that balanced dignity with a certain cool grandeur. He observed Genoese architecture, the way courtyards and staircases were designed to impress, and later published a book of architectural engravings based on these studies. Genoa taught him about secular power, about the aesthetics of wealth that was not royal but still absolute. He kept moving. He went back to Rome, back to Mantua. He painted altarpieces, portraits, mythologies. He absorbed Titian's late style, the way paint could be applied in loose, expressive strokes that read as form from a distance but dissolved into pure color up close. He studied Caravaggio's use of dramatic chiaroscuro, the way a single light source could carve a face or a hand out of darkness. He learned from Annibale Carràsi's integration of landscape and figure, the sense of an ideal world made tangible. By 1608, Rubens had been in Italy for 8 years. He was no longer a student. He was a master with a growing reputation, fluent in the visual languages of Venice, Rome, and Mantua. He had contacts across Italy and in Spain. He had seen more great art than almost any painter of his generation. He was ready to return north, but he might not have returned when he did if circumstance had not forced the choice. In October of 1608, Rubens received word that his mother was gravely ill. He left Italy immediately, traveling as quickly as he could across the Alps and through the territories of the empire. He reached Antwerp too late. Maria Piepelens had died before he arrived. She had held the family together through exile and disgrace. She had negotiated for her husband's life. She had brought her children back to Antwerp and positioned them within the restored Catholic order. Peter Paul had written to her regularly from Italy, but he had not seen her for 8 years. Her death ended the possibility of return as a visit. Rubens was now back in Antwerp for good. He did not intend to stay, at least not initially. He assumed he would settle affairs and return to Italy, perhaps to Rome, where he had commissions and connections. But within months of his return, the Archdukes Albert and Isabella, the rulers of the Spanish Netherlands, made him an offer he could not refuse. They appointed him court painter, gave him a generous salary, and crucially allowed him to remain in Antwerp rather than requiring him to move to Brussels, where the court was based. This was an extraordinary concession. It meant Rubens could establish himself in Antwerp, the commercial and artistic center of the region, while still enjoying the prestige and income of a court position. He accepted. In 1609, he bought a house on the Wapper and began converting it into a combined residence and workshop. In the same year, on the 3rd of October, he married Isabella Brandt, the daughter of a prominent Antwerp humanist and city official. She was 18, he was 32. They sat for a double portrait, now in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, showing the two of them in a garden bower, relaxed and elegant. Isabella is dressed in fine clothes, but not ostentatiously. Rubens wears a hat and a sword, the markers of a gentleman. They hold hands. The painting is tender without being sentimental. It suggests partnership, affection, a life being built together. Rubens set up his workshop with the efficiency of someone who understood that art, at the level he intended to practice it, was both a creative and a logistical endeavor. The house on the Wapper was designed to accommodate production on a large scale. There was a studio large enough for multiple assistants to work on different canvases simultaneously. There was a gallery for displaying finished works and for receiving visitors. There was a garden designed in the Italian style, with classical statuary and a portico modeled on Roman architecture. Rubens was creating an environment that signaled his dual identity. He was a painter, But he was also a scholar, a gentleman, a man of culture who had absorbed the best of Italy and brought it north. He began to take commissions at a pace that would have overwhelmed most painters: altarpieces for churches, portraits for nobles, mythologies for private collectors, decorative cycles for civic buildings. He worked quickly, sketching compositions in oil on small panels, then transferring those sketches to large canvases that his assistants would block in. Rubens would return to add the finishing touches: faces, hands, passages of drapery, anything that required individual attention. This method allowed him to produce an astonishing quantity of work without sacrificing quality, because the critical decisions, composition, color, expression, were made by Rubens himself, even if the execution was collaborative. His assistants were not hacks. They included Anthony van Dyck, who would become one of the great portraitists of the 17th century, and Jacob Jordaens, who developed into a major painter in his own right. Working for Rubens was an education, and the workshop became a training ground for the next generation of Flemish painters. But the work that announced Rubens as the preeminent painter in the north was not produced by the workshop method. It was painted largely by his own hand, and it was designed for the Cathedral of Our Lady in Antwerp, the largest and most important church in the city. In 1610, Rubens received the commission for a triptych to be installed on one of the cathedral's altars. The subject was the raising of the cross. He delivered it in 1611. The central panel showed Christ on the cross being hauled upright by a group of executioners, their bodies straining with effort. The composition was a violent diagonal, the cross tilting upward from lower left to upper right, dividing the picture space and creating a tremendous sense of exertion. The figures were massive, muscular, painted with a sense of weight and force that recalled Michelangelo but was more physical, less idealized. The light was dramatic, almost Caravagesque, but the color was Venetian, rich reds and golds against deep shadows. The painting was a synthesis of everything Rubens had learned in Italy, executed with a confidence that made the influences invisible. It was entirely his own. The success of the raising of the cross led directly to the commission for the descent from the cross, which Rubens began in 1612. The two triptychs were intended as pendants, balancing each other in the cathedral. If the raising was about violence and effort, the descent was about sorrow and tenderness. The central panel showed Christ's body being lowered from the cross by a group of figures arranged in a cascading composition. The body was pale, luminous, painted with a subtle gradation of tone that suggested both flesh and light. The white shroud wrapped around Christ caught the light and created a sweeping diagonal that led the eye downward. The figures surrounding him, John, Mary Magdalene, the Virgin, Nicodemus, were painted with individual care, each expressing a different shade of grief. The whole composition moved like a slow wave, from the top of the cross down to the waiting arms below. Rubens worked on the descent for more than 2 years, finishing it in 1614. He painted much of it himself, particularly the central panel. The side panels showed the visitation and the presentation of the temple, quieter scenes that framed the emotional intensity of the center. When the triptych was installed in the cathedral, it was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. People came to see it. Prints were made of the composition, spreading Rubens's fame across Europe. The painting demonstrated that Rubens could handle the most demanding religious subjects with both technical mastery and genuine emotional depth. It also demonstrated something more subtle, his ability to fuse northern and southern traditions. The composition and the treatment of the body were Italian, indebted to Raphael and Michelangelo and Caravaggio. But the attention to surface, the richness of color, the sense of light falling on fabric and skin, the individual characterization of the faces, these were Flemish, descended from Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden. Rubens had created a new kind of painting, one that belonged fully to neither tradition because it belonged completely to both. By the mid-1610s, Rubens was the most sought-after painter in Northern Europe. Commissions arrived from across the continent. The Jesuits in Antwerp commissioned a cycle of paintings for the ceiling of their new church, a project that required dozens of large canvases and took several years to complete. The church was a Baroque symphony of architecture and painting, with Rubens's canvases integrated into the ceiling in a way that made the entire interior a unified work of art. The cycle was destroyed by fire in the 18th century, but preparatory sketches survive, showing the energy and inventiveness Rubens brought to the project. He painted the life of Saint Ignatius, the miracles of Saint Francis of Xavier, the triumph of the Eucharist, subjects that required both narrative clarity and theological sophistication. The Jesuits were demanding patrons, but they were also highly educated, and Rubens could engage with them intellectually as well as artistically. He also painted for private patrons, producing mythologies and allegories that were more openly sensual. The Rape of the Daughters of Leucippus, painted around 1617 or 1618, showed two women being abducted by Castor and Pollux, the twin sons of Zeus. The women's bodies were twisting, luminous, painted with a sensuous attention to flesh that bordered on the erotic. The composition was dynamic, a spiral of interlocking limbs and horses and drapery, everything in motion. The painting was not illustrating a moral. It was reveling in the physicality of the human body, the beauty of movement, the energy of desire. Rubens returned to this kind of subject repeatedly. Diana and her nymphs, Venus and Adonis, the garden of love, subjects that allowed him to explore the body without the constraints of religious decorum. This was the central tension in Rubens's work, though it may not have seemed like a tension to him. He was a devout Catholic. He painted altarpieces that were designed to move viewers to piety. He worked for the Jesuits, the leading edge of the Counter-Reformation. And yet he also painted nudes that were frankly, joyously erotic, that celebrated the flesh, with an exuberance that had nothing to do with sin or redemption. The same hand that painted the body of Christ in the descent from the cross painted the abducted daughters of Leucippus, and both were painted with the same attention, the same love of form and color. For Rubens, there was no contradiction. The human body was a vehicle for both the sacred and the profane, and painting was about making that body visible in all its possibilities. In 1621, Rubens received a commission that would occupy him, on and off, for the next 4 years, and that would produce one of the most ambitious painting cycles of the Baroque era. Marie de Medici, the widow of King Henry IV of France and the mother of the reigning King Louis XIII, wanted a series of large paintings to decorate the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. The series was to depict her life, from her birth in Florence through her marriage, her regency, and her political struggles. It was, in effect, a hagiography in paint, designed to glorify Marie and legitimize her role in French politics. The problem was that Marie's life had been filled with conflict, scandal, and failure. She had clashed with her son. She had been exiled and recalled. The challenge for Rubens was to turn a messy political biography into a coherent visual narrative that would make Marie look wise, virtuous, and divinely favored. He solved the problem by turning to allegory. The cycle, which eventually comprised 24 large canvases, depicted Marie's life not as literal history but as a mythological epic. Events were staged with gods and personifications. Marie's arrival in France was attended by Neptune and sea nymphs. Her regency was blessed by figures representing justice and prudence. Conflicts were softened into allegories of discord overcome by wisdom. The paintings were sumptuous, filled with color and movement and incident. They were also, in their way, propagandistic, designed to shape how Marie would be remembered. Rubens negotiated the commission carefully, traveling to Paris in 1623 and 1625 to consult with Marie and her advisors, adjusting compositions based on their feedback. He understood that this was not just about painting. It was about managing a client's expectations, about diplomacy conducted through images. The Medici cycle was installed in the Luxembourg Palace in 1625. It was a triumph of decorative painting, and it secured Rubens's reputation not just as a great painter, but as someone who could handle large-scale projects with political and diplomatic sensitivity. It also marked the beginning of a shift in Rubens's career. He had always moved easily between the studio and the court, but after the Medici Commission, his diplomatic activities became more explicit. He began to carry letters, to negotiate on behalf of patrons, to serve as an intermediary between rulers who could not speak directly to each other. The transition was gradual, but by the late 1620s, Rubens was spending as much time on diplomacy as on painting. The political situation in Europe was deteriorating. The 30 Years' War, which had begun in 1618 as a conflict within the Holy Roman Empire, had spread across the continent, drawing in Spain, France, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic. The Spanish Netherlands, where Rubens lived, were caught between the Spanish crown and the rebellious northern provinces. Trade was disrupted, cities were threatened. The Archduchess Isabella, who had ruled the Spanish Netherlands jointly with her husband Albert until his death in 1621, was trying to negotiate a peace, or at least a truce, but her options were limited. Rubens, who had connections across Europe and a reputation for discretion, became one of her informal envoys. In 1627, Rubens traveled to the Dutch Republic on a mission that was officially about painting, but actually about exploring the possibility of peace negotiations. He met with officials, carried messages, assessed the political climate. The mission did not produce immediate results, but it established Rubens as a credible intermediary. In 1628, he went to Spain, ostensibly to present paintings to King Philip IV, but also to discuss diplomatic possibilities with the king's chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares. Rubens spent several months in Madrid, painting portraits, copying works from the royal collection, and engaging in conversations that had little to do with art. He met the young Diego Velázquez, who was just beginning his career as court painter. The two men respected each other, though they worked in very different modes. Velázquez was cool, precise, interested in the psychology of portraiture. Rubens was warm, expansive, interested in grand narratives and movement. But both understood that painting was a way of negotiating power. In 1629, Rubens was sent to England on a diplomatic mission that was no longer unofficial. He was tasked with negotiating a peace treaty between Spain and England, two countries that had been intermittently at war for decades. The mission was delicate. Both sides wanted peace, but distrusted each other. Rubens was chosen because he was not a professional diplomat, which made him seem less threatening, but he was also educated, cultured, and capable of moving in courtly circles without embarrassment. He arrived in London in June of 1629 and spent nearly a year there, meeting with King Charles I and his ministers, drafting proposals, managing the slow dance of negotiation. Charles I was a collector and a connoisseur. He had assembled one of the great art collections in Europe, acquiring works by Titian, Raphael, Mantegna, and Holbein. He and Rubens spoke the same language, both literally and figuratively. They discussed painting. Rubens painted an allegorical ceiling for the banqueting house in Whitehall, a commission that had been pending for years and that Rubens completed as a kind of diplomatic gift. The ceiling glorified the Stuart monarchy, depicting the apotheosis of James I and the blessings of peace and plenty that his reign had supposedly brought. It was propaganda, but it was also a masterpiece of illusionistic painting, with figures foreshortened to appear as if seen from below, floating in a sky that opened above the viewer's head. The peace treaty was signed in November of 1630. It was not a comprehensive settlement, too many issues remained unresolved, but it ended hostilities between England and Spain and created space for further negotiation. Rubens's role in the treaty was significant enough that both Charles I and Philip IV knighted him. He was now Sir Peter Paul Rubens, a title that acknowledged his service not just to art, but to the state. He returned to Antwerp in March of 1630, having been away for nearly a year. He was 52 years old. He had negotiated a treaty between two major powers. He had been honored by kings, and he was exhausted. In the summer of 1630, a few months after his return from England, Rubens's wife Isabella died. She had been ill for some time, possibly with the plague, though the exact cause of death is not certain. She was 34 years old. They had been married for 21 years. She had given him 3 children, a daughter, Clara Serena, who had died in 1623 at the age of 12, and 2 sons, Albert and Nicholas, who survived. Isabella had been a steady presence in Rubens's life, managing the household while he traveled, raising the children, providing a domestic foundation that allowed him to work at the pace he did. Her death left him bereft. He withdrew from public life for a time. He painted less. He wrote to friends about his grief, about the difficulty of continuing without her. In 1631, Rubens bought a country house, the Château d'Estaing, about 20 miles south of Antwerp. It was a modest estate by aristocratic standards, but it gave him land, a title of minor nobility, and a place to retreat from the pressures of the city and the court. He began to spend more time there, painting landscapes. These were not the allegorical or mythological landscapes he had painted earlier. They were direct studies of the Flemish countryside, fields and woods and rivers under wide skies. The landscapes were broad and open, painted with a freedom that suggested he was working for himself, not for a patron. They were peaceful, contemplative, the work of someone who had spent decades painting grand narratives and was now content to look at trees. In December of 1630, at the age of 53, Rubens married again. His second wife was Helena Formant, the daughter of a wealthy Antwerp merchant. She was 16 years old. The marriage was controversial, or at least it raised eyebrows. The age difference was stark. Rubens was old enough to be her grandfather. But the marriage seems to have been, by all accounts, happy. Helena was young, beautiful, and vital, and Rubens painted her constantly. She appears in mythological scenes as Venus, as Andromeda, as Bathsheba. She appears in portraits, sometimes clothed in sumptuous fabrics, sometimes barely clothed at all. The most intimate of these paintings, Het Pelsken, or The Little Fur, shows Helena standing nude except for a fur wrap draped loosely over her shoulders. She is turning slightly, looking out at the viewer with an expression that is neither coy nor bold, just present. The painting is life-sized. The light is soft, even, flooding the canvas. Helena's skin is pale, luminous, painted with a tenderness that suggests not idealization but love. The painting was never sold. Rubens kept it in his own collection, and in his will he stipulated that it should not be sold after his death. It was a private image painted for himself. Helena gave Rubens 5 children in the decade they were married. She presided over the household, which grew more elaborate as Rubens's wealth increased. She was also, in her way, his muse, though that term feels insufficient. She was not just a model. She was a presence in his life that brought him back to the body, to the domestic, to the pleasures of the everyday. The late mythologies painted in the 1630s are filled with her image, and they are filled with a kind of warmth that is different from the dynamic energy of the earlier work. There is still movement, still drama, but there is also a sense of ease, of abundance enjoyed rather than striven for. In 1635, Rubens was asked to contribute to the decorations for the joyous entry of the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand into Antwerp, a ceremonial event marking the arrival of the new governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Rubens designed a series of triumphal arches and stages decorated with allegorical paintings and inscriptions, a temporary city of images erected for a single day. The project required coordination with architects, poets, and city officials. It was spectacle on a grand scale, and Rubens orchestrated it with the ease of someone who had done this kind of thing many times before. The decorations were dismantled after the event, but prints and descriptions survive, showing the care and inventiveness Rubens brought even to ephemeral projects. He continued to paint, though at a slower pace. The workshop was still active, still producing altarpieces and portraits and mythologies for patrons across Europe. But Rubens himself was more selective about what he worked on. He painted more for himself, more landscapes, more intimate mythologies. In 1636, he began a series of paintings for Philip IV of Spain, a cycle illustrating the story of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The paintings were sensual, playful, filled with nymphs and gods and animals in transformation. They were painted loosely, with a freedom of handling that suggested Rubens was no longer concerned with finish in the conventional sense. The brushwork was visible, almost improvisatory. The colors were applied in broad strokes that read as form from a distance but remained pure color up close. This was Titian's late style, the style Rubens had studied 40 years earlier in Venice, now fully absorbed and made his own. In 1638, Rubens suffered an attack of gout, a condition that would plague him for the rest of his life. His hands became swollen and painful. Painting became difficult. He wrote to friends about his frustration, about the gap between what he wanted to do and what his body would allow, but he kept working. He painted a series of small mythologies, jewel-like panels filled with light and movement. He painted portraits of his children. He painted Helena again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with their children, always with a tenderness that belied the grand public persona he had cultivated for decades. In the spring of 1640, Rubens's health worsened. The gout spread. He was in constant pain. He could no longer hold a brush for long periods. He dictated letters. He received visitors. He made arrangements for his family, for the disposition of his collections, for the completion of unfinished commissions. On the 30th of May, 1640, Peter Paul Rubens died at his house on the Wapper in Antwerp. He was 62 years old. He was buried in the Church of St. James in Antwerp, beneath a painting he had made for his own Tomb of Virgin and Child, surrounded by saints, a quiet image after a life of monumental ones. The immediate response to Rubens's death was a recognition of loss, not just of a painter, but of a figure who had defined an era. Poets wrote elegies. Fellow artists mourned. Patrons who had relied on him scrambled to find others who could complete the commissions he had left unfinished. But no one could replace him, because what Rubens had done was not just about skill. It was about synthesis, about the ability to absorb an entire tradition and produce something that felt both inevitable and entirely new. The workshop continued for a while under the supervision of assistants, but it was not the same. Anthony van Dyck had already established himself as the leading portraitist in England. Jacob Jordanese took over some of Rubens's Antwerp commissions. But the engine that had driven the workshop Rubens's vision, his energy, his ability to sketch a composition in a few hours and guide a team of assistants to realize it at monumental scale, was gone. The work itself began its long journey through history, a journey marked by changes in taste and understanding. In the 18th century, Rubens was admired but also criticized for his excess, his fleshiness, his lack of classical restraint. Neoclassical critics found him too many bodies, too much movement, too much color. The ideal of beauty had shifted toward the linear, the cool, the restrained, and Rubens's abundance seemed, to some, like a failure of judgment. But the Romantics in the early 19th century saw something different. Eugene Delacroix, who was trying to break free from the neoclassical strictures that dominated French painting, looked at Rubens and saw freedom. He saw color as a vehicle for emotion, movement as a form of truth, the body as a site of energy rather than ideal proportion. Delacroix copied Rubens, studied him, wrote about him in his journals. He understood that Rubens had solved the problem of how to paint movement, how to make a static image feel alive. Delacroix's admiration for Rubens helped shift the broader perception of the artist. By the mid-19th century, Rubens was being reconsidered not as an artist of excess, but as an artist of vitality, someone who had understood that painting could be about more than ideal beauty. It could be about energy, about the life of paint itself. The Impressionists, who were interested in color and light, found things to admire in Rubens's handling. Renoir, in particular, responded to the sensuality of Rubens's nudes, the way flesh could be rendered not through precise drawing, but through modulation of color and tone. In the 20th century, Rubens's reputation became more complicated. The feminist critique of art history pointed out, rightly, that the bodies Rubens painted were almost always female, almost always idealized according to male desire, and often depicted in contexts of violence or abduction. The rape of the daughters of Lysippus, the countless images of Venus and nymphs, the mythological scenes where women are pursued or captured, these were not neutral celebrations of the human form. They were images made by a man for other men, images that encoded assumptions about gender, power, and desire. This critique did not erase Rubens's achievement, but it did complicate it, forcing a recognition that the abundance he painted was not universal, but particular, shaped by the values and hierarchies of his time. At the same time, the sheer scale of Rubens's production, the fact that he made more major paintings than perhaps any other artist of comparable quality in European history, continued to astonish. Scholars studied the workshop methods, the economics of artistic production, the ways Rubens managed his career. He became a model for understanding how art functioned not just as individual expression, but as a business, a collaborative enterprise, a form of cultural diplomacy. The letters he wrote, which survive in large numbers, revealed a mind that was as much concerned with politics and humanism as with painting, a man who read Seneca and Tacitus, who corresponded with scholars, who thought about images as arguments. The paintings themselves, when seen in person, retain a power that resists reduction to context or critique. The Descent from the Cross in Antwerp Cathedral still stops visitors, still commands attention through the sheer authority of its composition and the tenderness of its central image. The late landscapes, when encountered in museums, offer a vision of the natural world that is both grand and intimate, painted with a freedom that feels almost modern. The mythologies, for all their gendered assumptions, remain visually astonishing, full of light and color and movement. Rubens understood something fundamental about painting, that it is a physical medium, that it exists in the realm of the senses, and that its power comes not just from what it represents, but from how it makes you feel when you stand in front of it. There is a painting in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna called The Fur. It is another image of Helena Formant, painted around 1638, when Rubens was in his early 60s and Helena was in her mid-20s. She stands nude, her body turned slightly, one hand holding a fur wrap that does not so much cover her as frame her. The painting is life-sized. The light is even, almost flat, falling on her skin in a way that suggests no particular time of day, just light itself. Her expression is calm, direct, without performance. The painting is not about seduction or mythology or allegory. It is about presence, about a body in space, about the relationship between a painter and his subject, which in this case was also the relationship between a husband and his wife. Rubens kept the painting in his private collection. It was not made for a patron. It was not part of a cycle or a commission. It was made because he wanted to paint her, because after decades of painting bodies for others' bodies in motion, bodies in transformation, bodies illustrating stories from the Bible or from Ovid, he wanted to paint this particular body, this woman he lived with, without any narrative or justification. The painting is quiet in a way that most of Rubens's work is not. There is no drama, no exertion, no divine intervention, just light on skin, the texture of fur, the presence of a person. It is tempting to read the late paintings as a kind of resolution, a movement from the public to the private, from the grand narratives of the altarpieces and the diplomatic missions to the quiet intimacy of the landscapes and the portraits of Helena. But that reading risks simplifying a life that was never simple. Rubens did not retire into domesticity. He continued to take commissions, to negotiate with patrons, to manage the workshop. The late work exists alongside the public work, not as a replacement for it. The same man who painted the fur also painted the ceiling of the banqueting house. The same man who bought a country estate and painted Flemish fields also designed triumphal arches for visiting governors. Rubens did not choose between these identities. He inhabited all of them, and he seems to have felt no need to reconcile them. The central tension in Rubens's life, if it was a tension, was between the body as a site of pleasure and the body as a site of suffering, between the flesh celebrated in the mythologies and the flesh crucified in the altarpieces. But for Rubens, this was not a contradiction. Both were true. The body was capable of beauty and of agony, of desire and of sacrifice, and painting was the medium through which both could be made visible. He painted Christ's body with the same attention he gave to Venus's, the same understanding of weight and light and surface. He did not paint them the same one was about suffering, the other about pleasure. But he painted both with a seriousness that suggested he believed the body, in all its forms, was worth looking at, worth rendering, worth taking seriously. This is what remains when the arguments about politics and gender and workshop practice have been made. The images themselves, their surfaces, their light, the way they hold your attention. The descent from the cross still asks you to feel the weight of grief, the difficulty of letting go. The rape of the daughters of Leucippus still asks you to look at bodies in motion, to see beauty in violence or violence in beauty, depending on how you look. The late landscapes still offer a vision of the world as a place of abundance, where light falls evenly on fields and rivers and the sky is wide and open. The portraits of Helena still suggest that intimacy is possible, that a painting can be an act of love. Rubens died at a moment when the world he had known was changing. The 30 Years' War would continue for another 8 years, ending in a settlement that redrew the map of Europe and weakened the Spanish Habsburg Empire he had served. The Spanish Netherlands would remain under Spanish control but would decline in power and influence. Antwerp, which had been the center of Rubens's world, would be eclipsed by Amsterdam, the capital of the Dutch Republic, which was becoming the commercial and cultural center of Northern Europe. The Catholic renewal that Rubens had helped visualize through his altarpieces and his work for the Jesuits would continue, but it would increasingly be on the defensive, challenged by Protestant states and by a broader shift towards secularism and skepticism. But if Rubens's world was ending, his work persisted. The paintings he left behind, over 1,400 of them by some counts, though the exact number is disputed because of the workshop's involvement, became part of the permanent collection of European culture. They were copied, studied, engraved, collected. They shaped the way subsequent generations thought about color, about composition, about the body. They influenced artists across centuries: Watteau in the 18th century, Delacroix and Renoir in the 19th, even painters in the 20th century who were trying to understand what it meant to paint flesh, to render weight and light on a flat surface. The myth of Rubens, which began to form even before his death, is the myth of abundance. He was the artist who gave everything without running dry, who painted more, traveled more, negotiated more, lived more than seemed possible for one person. He was the master of the grand gesture and the intimate detail, the painter of altarpieces that filled cathedrals and small panels that he kept for himself. He was the diplomat who prevented wars, and the painter who celebrated the flesh. He was the scholar who read Seneca in Latin, and the craftsman who understood how to grind pigments and stretch canvas. He was all of these things, and he did not seem to struggle with the contradictions. He simply worked. There is a phrase that recurs in accounts of Rubens's life, a phrase his contemporaries used to describe him. He was a prince among painters and a painter among princes. It is a courtly phrase, a phrase designed to flatter, but it also captures something true. Rubens moved between worlds, the world of the studio and the world of the court, the world of images and the world of politics, with an ease that suggests he did not see them as separate. For him, painting was a form of diplomacy, and diplomacy was a form of painting. Both required vision, skill, the ability to see what others might not see, and to make it visible. In the church of St. James in Antwerp, above the altar where Rubens is buried, there is a painting of the Virgin and Child surrounded by saints. The Virgin holds the Christ child in her arms. Saints stand around her, Mary Magdalene, John the Evangelist, Jerome, others each painted with individual care. The composition is calm, balanced, without the dynamic movement of the great altarpieces. It is a late work, painted in the 1630s, when Rubens was thinking about his own death, about what he would leave behind. The painting includes a self-portrait, not prominent, but there, Rubens himself as St. George, standing to the side, holding a shield, looking outward. It is a quiet presence, a way of signing the image, of claiming a place within it. The painting is still there, in the church, above the tomb. Visitors come to see it, though fewer now than in Rubens's own time. The church is quieter than it was in the 17th century, when Antwerp was a center of power and faith and commerce. But the painting remains, doing what Rubens intended it to do, holding a space, marking a place, offering an image of grace and presence that outlasts the life that made it. Rubens understood that paintings were not just objects. They were arguments, propositions, acts of persuasion. They were also, at their best, acts of attention, ways of looking at the world and finding it worth rendering. He looked at bodies and found them magnificent, whether they were suffering or celebrating, whether they were draped in silk or bare-skinned in a landscape. He looked at light and found it endlessly variable, warm in the afternoon sun on a Flemish field, dramatic on the pale body of Christ in the cathedral. He looked at movement and found ways to paint it, to make stillness suggest motion, to make a canvas feel alive. This is what remains, after the fame and the commissions and the diplomatic missions have faded into history. The paintings themselves, the surfaces he left behind, the colors he mixed, the compositions he designed, the bodies he rendered. They are in their way a kind of abundance, a reminder that the world is full of things worth looking at, that the body is capable of beauty and of suffering, that light changes everything it touches, that painting at its best is an act of love for the subject, for the medium, for the act of seeing itself. Rubens gave everything, and he did not run dry. That is the myth. And it is also, when you stand in front of the paintings, the truth. The work remains, and it asks you to look, to see the weight of a body being lowered from a cross, the light on a woman's skin, the wide sky over a Flemish field. It asks you to pay attention, to linger, to let the image settle in your mind the way light settles on a surface. And if you give it time, if you let it, the work does what Rubens intended. It fills the space. It gives you something to see. It gives you the world, rendered in paint, abundant and alive.